Without objection, Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm glad to hear both of our witnesses today say that Section 230, that they are open to reform, because I think it's fair to say the Internet has outgrown Section 230. And while we've made some modifications when it comes to terrorism and when it comes to child exploitation, I think there's more to do. But I think the question is going to be how this regulation is going to come to pass. I know there's some, including on this committee, who suggest that maybe we ought to create a private right of action so that individuals can sue over claims of violated rights on your platforms. I think that's one form of regulation. It's called regulation by litigation, but it's certainly not my first choice, and it's not optimal. And I don't think it's something we ought to be embracing in the first instance. But I do think it's critical that each of you and your counterparts work with us to try to come up with something that will address the concerns. And the basic concern I have is it's hard to know exactly how to classify your business model. It's we have a provision in the Bill of Rights protecting freedom of the press, but yet here, while we would never let the government regulate what the press writes or doesn't write, essentially we are allowing private companies, which are now de facto public forums, to regulate that speech. And I'm no more comfortable delegating those decisions to you than I am delegating to you my vote in the last or upcoming elections. You know, Louis Brandeis famously said that the solution for bad speech is not less speech, it's more speech. And it seems to me like the practices that you are engaging in to tag, remove, and otherwise censor speech on your platforms violates that principle. And I'd like to know why that shouldn't be a better approach by allowing more speech rather than censoring what is perceived as bad speech. And then, as I think I've discussed with you, Mr. Zuckerberg, I think we're all sort of struggling to come up with what the appropriate analogy here is to your business model. We know as newspapers have become less profitable and many of them gone out of business, there's been consolidation in the news media. There is a proliferation of cable TV shows and people being able to get information through a variety of sources, but there's no Walter Cronkite or the big TV networks that with the trusted anchor person who people have confidence in, that they will shoot with them straight. And so I know it's a very difficult thing to manage, but I would just encourage both of you not to wait for the lawsuits. We saw what happened to Microsoft. I think Bill Gates said that was one of his biggest mistakes, failing to engage with some of the antitrust concerns when it came to Microsoft, and he learned that the hard way. And I think there is a better way for the American people, and that's if we work on this together. Mr. Zuckerberg, I believe that Facebook publishes on a quarterly basis a report of its actions in this area. Is that correct?
Senator, that's correct.
And could you describe that for us and what motivated you to undertake that sort of transparency?
Yes. Senator, I believe that in order for people to trust that we're doing a good job, they have to be able to see the results. And we have to be able to break down on a content on a kind of category by category basis across all the different categories of harm, whether it's terrorist content or child exploitation or incitement of violence or pornography or intellectual property violations, how much of the violating content is on our platforms and how effective our systems are at removing it. And what we hold ourselves accountable towards is getting as high a percent of this harmful content down, addressing it, before real people have to experience it and report it to us themselves. So in categories where we do quite well, for example, in fighting against terrorist content, our AI systems and counterterrorism teams are able to remove 98 or 99% of that harmful content before anyone has to report it to us. In other categories, it's more challenging and we're still making more progress. But I think that as part of a regulatory framework here, it would be good if every company had to issue a transparency report outlining what they're seeing on their platforms and the results and effectiveness of their content moderation systems. So that way, the people who are responsible for holding all of us accountable, whether it's journalists, Congress, academics, could have an apples to apples comparison about how all the different companies are doing, and potentially, as part of a law, require that companies even maintain a certain level of effectiveness.
Thank you. Mr. Dorsey, when Twitter decided to take down the story, the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop, did you do that under your terms of service, or did you do it under some other claim of authority?
We did it under our terms of service, which, as you know, everyone agrees to when they sign up for Twitter. And this was a policy around distribution of hacked materials. We did not want Twitter to be a distribution point for hacked materials.
Well, you do realize that by taking down that story, you probably gave it more prominence and more visibility than it ever would have gotten had you left it alone.
We realize that, and we recognize it as a mistake that we made, both in terms of the intention of the policy and also the enforcement action of not allowing people to share it publicly or privately, which is why we corrected it within 24 hours.
And Mr. Dorsey, why isn't Justice Brandeis's formulation in Whitney versus California, why shouldn't that apply to the internet platforms like yours? In other words, the cure for bad speech is not censorship, it's more speech. Why wouldn't that principle apply to Twitter?
I think it does apply. All of our policies are focused on encouraging more speech. What we saw and what the market told us was that people would not put up with abuse, harassment, and misleading information that would cause offline harm. And they would leave our service because of it. So our intention is to create clear policy, clear enforcement that enables people to feel that they can express themselves on our service and ultimately trust it.
So it was a business decision.
It was a business decision.
Thank you.